Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Doorstep Book Talks. I'm your co host, a senior fellow here at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow at Carnegie Council. So very excited to welcome Amy Webb, co-author of The Genesis Machine. My usually bookmarked. If you've seen the Doorstep Book Talks before, you know that I love reading and I love this book so much. Speaking with us today about this wonderful book. And I'm going to start the intro by saying, Amy, I saw you a few years ago speak at ONA conference, Online News Station
Yeah.
Conference. And I just was so inspired by your talk and the Future Today Institute. So a little bit of background on Amy today. She is the CEO of the Future Today Institute, which is in the business of collecting data and modeling data and finding patterns and describing plausible futures, which is what this book is also about. And we'll talk a little bit about how you put that also in the book. You're a professor of strategic foresight at NYU Stern School of Business. Although I want to talk about your work as a futurist, we will try to stick to the book, and we invite the audience to ask questions as we go along. You co-authored the book with Andrew Hessel, so I do want to give him a shout out too, a geneticist and an entrepreneur, and the two of you together have created such an inspiring read about an industry that is set to really explode. I know in the book you talk about it being at its very beginnings, sort of like before we had the telephone, right? The very beginnings. But the pace of change, as we know in tech, is super rapid. And so what we're talking about today for our audience is synthetic biology and how it's going to change the way we live, the way we parent, the way we eat, the way we identify. So many applications of this technology that we are at the cusp of, but we need to do a lot of work to understand it. And Amy, I love the fact that you talk about how the book is your foray into helping start the conversation, among regulators, entrepreneurs, moneyed people, right? All the billionaires that are in this space, but also the regular day-to-day people. And that's what we try to do here at the Doorstep, is to bring issues to people that they should be thinking about and maybe don't understand or are misinformed about. And you talk a lot about misinformation. We'll get into that in our talk tonight too. As a journalist, I really am anti misinformation, and I'm pro news literacy. And it's so interesting because you talk about bioliteracy. And so I want to talk about that with you too tonight. There's just so much. So we'll get started. And I'd like to start off because I do think some of our audience might not be familiar with what is this new growing field of synthetic biology. And maybe you could just kind of give us a little bit of a lay of the land to start us off, and then we'll delve into your book a bit more.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And it's great to hear that you were at ONA. Whenever that was, I used to be on the board of directors. So it's an organization near and dear to my heart. And thanks everybody for being here to learn a little bit more about this book that Andrew and I wrote about a somewhat esoteric emerging area of science and technology, but a field that you will be hearing much more about pretty soon over the coming years. So the backdrop to this book is that, Andrew's a scientist. I'm a person who works in strategic foresight. We both think a lot about the future. And what I do for a living is sort of model signals, forces, trends, and try to understand their next order impacts and the effects that those would have on government, on business, individual companies, things like that. And there really is one area of change that I think is so profound and has potentially, such a dramatic impact across so many industries that I decided to write a book about it. And then about midway through, asked Andrew if he'd like to join. So the book is about something called synthetic biology. It's totally fine if you haven't heard this phrase before. Synthetic biology is the name for an emerging area of science that involves redesigning organisms for useful purposes by engineering them to have new abilities or adapted or edited abilities. And that can range from something as small as a molecule all the way on up to something as big as an elephant. So synthetic biology is interdisciplinary. So this combines engineering, design, computer science, all with the intent to tinker with biology in new ways. And what's interesting about this is if you sort of have used a computer before, this is analogous to the permissions that we have with computer code, except we're talking about biological code. So, we have read access to documents, we have write access to documents. Well, similarly, in biology, when Watson and Crick built on, without giving credit, the research of Rosalind Franklin, that gave us the insight that there is, a double helix, and that set us on a path to being able to read the genome, genetic sequences. More recently, there's something called CRISPR, which is a technique that allows us to edit. And what synthetic biology does is give us write permissions. So using a computer, scientists are able to edit sequences, put them in new combinations, test out new things, and effectively send that computer code to something like a 4-dimensional printer or 3-dimensional printer, which prints out, as crazy as this sounds, new living organisms. And while we probably immediately think that this means, creating designer babies, and genetic engineering on human is definitely out there, but on a slightly longer horizon. More importantly, what this means is optionality. It gives us different ways to approach agriculture, to approach, drug discovery and therapeutics, even to help mitigate some of the challenges of climate change. There are enormous risks, but also lots of opportunities. And the purpose of the book is to give you the knowledge, the background, the insights now, so that when we start to confront these risks and opportunities, we can have a reasonable public discussion and make good decisions that are in everybody's best interests.
Yeah, and I think that you really lay that out. And for me, it was your whole discussion on the analogy to artificial intelligence,
Right.
And how that all came to be, and we're reacting to it versus getting ahead of it. And maybe you can go into that analogy and some of the things that you think we should do to mitigate the risk. So in the book, you have 9 risks, but it's so optimistic. I want to say that you pose it in a way that doesn't get people scared. I think of this idea that you can edit a gene and create something new, because I do think, and I'm going to have to read this because I love this, what you said, that we have had creator control for a long time, right? That this isn't something new that we're doing, to the environment. Like, we've been playing the role of creator. This is the world we created, not through intelligent planning and intentional design, but through mindless evolution made through centuries of choices and actions, which continue to play out in unpredictable ways, as related to climate change, for example, or our food chain system. And now we can step back and we can say, wait a minute, for centuries, we haven't thought things through. We've been reactive, but now let's be proactive.
Yes, there's a lot in that question. So let me see if I can unpack some of it. So so you mentioned artificial intelligence. What's very interesting is that synthetic biology is kind of an umbrella term that encompasses different technologies and the greater bioeconomy. There's an interesting overlap between artificial intelligence and this field. And that's because computers are involved, as is automation and things like predictions, making predictions and solving problems. So there's computation involved. The more powerful our AI systems become, by default, the more powerful our biological tools become. And a lot of people don't know this, but there's an overlap between the technology companies building the forefront of AI, the investors that are funding AI, and the technology companies and the investors that are now in synthetic biology. So there's a lot of familiar sort of usual suspects. Even companies like NVIDIA, which works in computer processing and image rendering and image generation, and computer vision, they are also working in SynBio, as is Salesforce. And many people recognize Salesforce as the global juggernaut in keeping track of who's what in what are called CRMs. So knowing people. Well, it's interesting. They also have a segment of that organization dedicated to this type of research. So what does that mean for the future of how we think about evolution? Well, again, technology is impacting, has some influence on human evolution. It's certainly changed society, and even down to things like eyesight. I was looking at some data the other day or a while ago. People are significantly more myopic. Kind of a double meaning there. We're definitely more myopic, but biologically, we're also more myopic, which is another way of saying nearsighted. Than ever before. And the number of people who need corrective lenses is accelerating at a faster pace than ever before in human history, at least as long as we've been aware that people need corrective lenses. Why? Well, pre-COVID, we were already spending a lot of time on screens, and our eyes were initially evolved to look for danger. So things that were far away that might eat us, attack us and eat us. We have not evolved, our eyes have not evolved as fast as the technology around us. And as a result, we can't accommodate looking near and far over and over again at the same time, in lights. So what does that mean? Everybody has to wear more glasses. So technology has already started to influence our biology, and that's just one of many examples. But it's interesting for us to think about using technology to influence biology itself. And one of the arguments that we make in the book is, oftentimes when we talk about editing or creating new living structures, new life forms in whatever form they may take, there is a religious and spiritual element to this. And it is it challenges our current mental models. The argument that we're making is that through our decisions, whether that's to stare at a computer or a phone all day long, or to, make decisions about how we're planting things, how we're emitting CO2, we are very much playing the role of creator. We just don't think about it that way. And what we're advocating is that as we pursue this new avenue of technology and science, we just get smarter about that creator position and the outcomes that we want to see.
Can I touch on that? Because you mentioned a number of areas where, synthetic biology really backs into core doorstep issues, particularly for politicians around the world: food supply, energy, uh, dealing with pandemics, and the extent to which the rapid ability to develop vaccines for COVID, that is tied to this new technology that wouldn't have been available 20 years ago when we first had the first wave of SARS and other similar coronaviruses. But then the question, as you said, of, well, who's actually in charge, or who's actually doing this? And it really reminded me of the doorstep podcast that we did with Christian Davenport about space. That it's really, governments are really playing more of a back seat. There are investors, there are people in the tech field, there are visionaries, but it does seem that a lot of this is occurring not as something as societies have made choices, but that there are people making choices for societies, that, as you said, that then either the societies will have to adapt to, or that may produce a reaction. Is there a sense, as you've been covering this, of to what extent are the people that are most involved, both individuals, but also the companies that are most involved in synthetic biology? Is it just simply a matter of we're trying to solve certain problems, we see a profit stream, or are there people saying this really allows us to sort of set a direction for human society that isn't being set by governments?
Mhm.
Again, I'm thinking of the Peter Thiels or the Elon Musks that really say we want to kind of take human society, whether to space or out to sea or elsewhere, in different ways. But really, who makes the call? And you did raise the question too of sort of philosophical and religious movements as well. I mean, is this a way of we're seeing kind of power shift away from traditional forms to those who will be able to have these tools at their disposal?
Right. So I think the challenge that we continually face is that our form of government asks people to make choices about who they want in various positions. And that's a good thing. It also means that it's very difficult to set long-term strategy. And the bottom line is that the more vitriolic our politics gets in this country, the further away we get from long-term visioning. We are at a moment in time where without that long-term vantage point and the wherewithal to stick to it, we become globally less competitive. It also creates a strategic vulnerability when it comes to diplomatic, militaristic, and and other avenues. So the solution to that is either erecting a national office of strategic foresight, which I've suggested and written a paper on, and someday maybe our government will adopt it. Or to figure out a way to do some of this long-term planning, because investors are, every investor, every big firm is looking at this space. Many are already invested in this space. We're sort of at the building the foundations stage versus the end consumer product stage. We have a very haphazard approach in the United States, and just like our government really wasn't thinking through the long-term trajectory of artificial intelligence until very recently. The same is very true when it comes to this space. However, that is not the case in China, where both AI and synbio and biotech, and also biotech related industries, are part of their 14th five-year plan. It's part of their strategic roadmap, part of their sovereign wealth fund, is dedicated to this space. We do not see the same, we see similarities in places like Singapore, which is already pushed through regulatory approval to allow synthetic meat. So this is cellular-based meat products versus plant-based meat products to go on sale. We're seeing movement outside of the US. So this is bad for a couple of reasons. One, this is an area that involves life. So it involves cells and to some degree stem cells. So when we have administrative changes and we have, people who are maybe leaning more to the right in power, that completely upends policy. It also changes funding. I mean, it completely collapses the existing roadmap for how this stuff develops. And this is coming at a really challenging time because there are things that are happening. We also have some needs, and we're also just falling behind everybody else. Now, there's another piece of this, which is this technology does potentially give us optionality in agriculture. Agriculture, depending on who you talk to, hasn't changed much in between 14,000 and 10,000 years. There really haven't been any fundamental changes. This technology gives us the ability to influence what that future looks like. And we're going to need to do that because there is no way in hell that all countries around the world are going to align on CO2 reductions. It's just, there's the economic forces working, the headwinds against that are too strong. So isn't there another way for us to think through the outcomes of that? Because what we do know to be true is that extreme weather events are going to increase, not decrease. So we have these external variables that we know, that we've got data for, that we can chart. We don't know the outcomes, but we know they exist. So that tells us that we have a global food supply problem somewhere on the horizon. That should be an incentive to do long horizon planning, to bring different approaches, like bring a lot of farming indoors, which, you talk to farmers and they say, don't tell us how to do our jobs. That's not possible. I know that it is. I also come from a part of my family who were commercial farmers. So I know, right? This is different.
Yeah.
And we don't have direction, strategic direction at a national level on how to think this through. And then worse, let's say that we do significantly innovate in this space. That's going to start to create new geopolitical problems. There are countries that rely on our exports. There are countries that rely on our imports. And if suddenly we shrink the global supply chain down so that the agriculture and agricultural production looks really different, that could create a new security problem. All of these things, and by the way, that's one tiny, tiny segment of what our government should be discussing and thinking about, but isn't. All of these things are addressable now. And if we had the political will to do long-term planning and to stick with that plan, regardless of who is in office, then we would be rowing a boat in a positive direction altogether to the future. But we're not doing that. We're not doing that. And there are other countries that are.
I think the China example, and you use it a couple of times in the book, is a really interesting one. And we talk here at the doorstep a great deal about China and its influence and implications in so many sectors here in the US that people don't really realize. And in this particular instance, it's not just that they'll get ahead of us. It's this idea, and you mention it in the book, and it's one of the extreme examples of how synthetic biology could potentially be used for, you'd call it dual purpose, right? There's a good part and there's a bad part. So could you, and that's one of the risks that you mentioned that got me thinking, of the 9, because there is great opportunity, as we've discussed, but there are also these drawbacks, and especially in the China example, can you talk with our audience through that example that you have in the book?
Sure. So there's dual use, and then there are the challenges presented by China. So maybe let me separate the two of those. With every new science and technology, there's always the possibility that somebody is going to take that science or tech and use it for nefarious purposes. So we call this dual use. And it has been ever present. The example that I give in the book has to do with the invention of chemicals that were later used as chemical weapons. To be fair, I could use, I could use a fork and stab you in the neck with a fork. A fork would be a deadly weapon, right? if I stab you with it. Most of the time, that's not what's happening. We're eating with forks. That's a glib example, but it does highlight the challenge here, and that is to acknowledge risk that is plausible without sensationalizing it. And sometimes, especially now with the way that our communication happens virtually and digitally, that's harder and harder to do. In this case, if we are talking about, editing organisms, of course, there is the potential for dual use, either intentionally or unintentionally. If you live anywhere on the East Coast, you've probably seen in the summertime, and this is starting to happen now, trees covered in like a horrific invasive vine. That vine is called kudzu. And kudzu was introduced to the United States just after the Dust Bowl. And the reason for this was it was meant to be a solution. It was meant to rewild and regreen areas that were just devastated after horrific droughts. Well, nobody really thought through the next order impacts, and the next order impacts are now abundance. There's so much of that vine growing in so many places that it has choked off the vegetation that was originally there. So that's an example of sort of an unintended, unforeseen use case. That's dual use. And when it comes to biology, biology tends to self-sustain. And at the moment, it's not really possible for us to engineer an off switch at scale. So that's, that's something for us to consider. Now, is it likely or even plausible that somebody might, engineer intentionally the next kudzu that infiltrates other parts of the country? I mean, probably not. But we don't want to rule that out. Now, there's intentional dual use, right? Or somebody intentionally taking a technology and weaponizing it. And, one of the arguments that we're making in the book is that is very possible. And it's possible that happens at a state level. We know that China is, and we have lots of evidence in the book describing all of this. We know that there's research happening that probably would not pass muster in other parts of the world. We know that something called gain of function research is being practiced in various places around the world. In 2011, one of the stories we tell is a researcher in Rotterdam that announced that he had augmented the H5N1 bird flu virus so that it could be transmitted from birds to humans and then between people as a new airborne deadly strain of the flu. And you would ask yourself, literally, why would anybody do that? And the answer was because, he was trying to, in his words, mutate the hell out of the virus to see how bad it could get in the name of predicting mutations and developing cures. Now, pre-COVID, H5N1 was the worst virus to hit our planet for humans since the Spanish flu. It had a super high mortality rate, but it was nothing like, what we're currently dealing with. There is no reason today to do gain of function research. It's a stupid thing to pursue. We have predictive models. DeepMind, which is part of Google, has figured out every way that protein folds. There is no reason to do this type of research other than for use as a bioweapon. So one of the concerns I certainly have, but we make the case in the book about this is, we don't want to be in a situation where there's a new form of bioescalation. And the perception of one country enhancing anything, whether that's anything for competitive purposes or to make its security stronger, whatever it might be, that is really dangerous. To me, that is much more concerning. And I'm a kid I was an 80s kid. So I remember the Cold War very well. And I remember being terrified of nuclear war. And as scared as I was about that, this is a completely different beast, much more concerning, but also avoidable.
Yeah, with that, and can I ask you, you talk about, again, it's other states have these capabilities, they may be moving in different directions. But again, also, to what extent do these technologies in synthetic biology begin to move out of the hands of sort of large organizations? At what point do they begin to drop to the level that smaller groups of people, smaller businesses, but also, as we saw in 1995 with Ayum Shinrikyo in Japan, that the group says, we want to engineer an apocalypse. To what extent are we running or do you see the risks of that this technology, as with AI and other things, can scale downward to where more and more people can have access to it?
Yeah, so I used to live in Japan, and I actually moved there about 18 months after that horrific sarin gas attack. And so, and I people were still reeling from it all that time later. That was a case where they didn't engineer something new; they just acquired something that existed. And again, we can. Anybody can acquire tools that are disruptive. I think the question you're getting at, is how easily accessible is this technology to individuals, to rogue actors, to people who want to inflict real damage on others? I don't, there's still quite a bit of a learning curve here, and there still are lots of processes and procedures that have to be followed. You can't just print anything you want. You still have to get reagents. You've got to get materials. So the learning curve, the probability that somebody engineers something bad is orders of magnitude lower. than somebody acquiring an existing dangerous agent and releasing that in a way that's harmful. I'm actually not super concerned about, at the moment, about individuals or small groups making use of these technologies. I'm actually much more concerned that we're going to drag our heels on this stuff for so long that when some breakthroughs happen, lawmakers are going to wake up from their slumber and decide at that point to regulate. And in the United States, I just think that that would be catastrophic. We are facing existential threats. It doesn't at this point matter to me, the argument over who caused what. We have a climate change problem. There is no other way it is, right? So let's acknowledge that and, put the considerable might and will and finances of the United States into solving that problem using alternative solutions, which we are not currently doing. Yeah. My concern has to do with missed opportunities that wind up becoming policy problems and legal arguments and craziness. That concerns me. The fact that we have IP problems is a chapter in the book about something called golden rice, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point. But the end of that story is that this was a product that was intended to be given away. The patents were intended to be given away, much like the original patent for insulin was intended to be made public so that anybody could manufacture and help people. But when it came to this rice product, there were so many other, the IP on this became so insane that there was no way for them to release the code and the process for free because it would have infringed on like 70 patents. Likewise, in the past few months, patents that, the Patent and Trademark Office reversed its decision on who owned patents for CRISPR, whether it was Berkeley, a public institution, or the Broad Institute, a private institution. This continual back and forth and this murkiness, and that is very, in some ways, unique to the United States. That concerns me. And then obviously misinformation concerns me. Honestly, I'm much more concerned about that at this point than I am about some guy getting his hands on synthetic biology equipment and materials and trying to engineer something.
But let's stick with the patent issue, because it's the patents here and globally. And I think a very effective argument you make in the book is that we need to create kind of a global discussion, a global group. You call it a Bretton Woods for this area where we kind of have a consensus about how this is going to be managed, from who's going to manage it to patent structure, and talk to us a little bit more about that. I'm seeing questions come in the chat. Thank you very much. We'll get them in a few moments, and bring them on. Bring your questions in. You don't have to have read the book. We were fortunate to get it in advance, and we want you to read it, ask your questions, and then get the book.
Thank you. Right. So again, we have a challenge when it comes to IP and regulation specifically, because countries are misaligned on what both are. In the United States, we tend to regulate products versus process. And there's good reason for that. The government wants to encourage growth and innovation, and nobody wants to regulate how scientists are doing their work in the lab. So all of that makes sense. However, we're in the middle of using and creating new processes that have just never existed before. So turning a blind eye to that until there's a big inflection point is an invitation to, challenging people's expectations, and it invites problems down the road. It's much better for policymakers to be thinking through, how is our regulatory framework going to have to change? We have something called the coordinated framework. It's like 3 different agencies' regulations kind of kludged together. And that's what we're doing. It's the year 2022. That's how we've chosen to operate this. And as murky as things are in the US, they're equally murky all around the world. And there's not a lot of alignment. There are global discussions starting to happen. So the World Economic Forum has a council on synthetic biology, and they're trying to think through what that looks like. Eric Schmidt, through Schmidt Futures, Eric Schmidt was the former CEO of Google, and then Alphabet. Through his foundation, this is something that they are trying to galvanize a global conversation on. But global conversations have to lead to actions, and we don't have a framework for this. So there's the BWC. There are conventions against bioweapons. What we don't have is a framework that encourages innovation and enables people to profit, while also setting a roadmap, a strategic roadmap, as well as guardrails and sort of guidelines that are enforceable. We don't have that, and it's not. We're not incenting collaboration. So the model that we propose is based on Bretton Woods. My academic background is economics and game theory, so that's to some degree where some of this is coming from. But I really spent a long time trying to find an analogous model of some way to bring people to the table, to incent them to make good decisions, governments to make good decisions, and that was the best model that I could find. And the idea here is, if the countries that are members of this are all incentivized to align and collaborate, and the penalties are great for those who deviate, then I think we have something, and we have a way to work and to move forward. We actually have lots of recommendations that range from how there should be a global consortia that is, accountable and working toward decisions in a quicker way than typically happens, all the way down to individual levels. We talk about George Church, who's a preeminent geneticist, who said, we have to have a license to drive a vehicle. Maybe we should have to have a license to operate synthetic biology. And we agree. We would take that many steps further. And we explain how in the book we think the right approach is to enable people to do their research and to really innovate while keeping a watchful eye on what they're doing and how to make sure we have good, effective safety standards.
Yeah, so we have, we've addressed climate and food supply, but I think one of the other areas, and something that really resonated with me, is health. The positive potential for health. As a cancer survivor, I really loved the description of creating a specific cure or a solution for your particular cancer, because everybody's cancer is a little bit different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, as opposed to like going in and getting your chemo and then the doctor's adjusting it. Well, how about we do a screen beforehand and then give you the appropriate diagnosis and solution. And so that to me was a really tangible example, again, bringing it to the doorstep of how synthetic biology could help improve our lives. Are there other examples maybe for our audience to bring it home into this sector that I think is also super important, this health and wellness sector that we can talk about?
Right. So this book is deeply personal. It opens with a very intimate look into my life and to Andrew's life, and we bring up health issues throughout. So I'm not spoiling anything by explaining this, but the book opens with Andrew and I separately trying to get pregnant. And in my case, I was told repeatedly there was nothing wrong with me. I was pregnant 9 times, and I've had 1 child. Some of those pregnancies, all 8 of those pregnancies resulted in miscarriage, and they ranged from miscarriage after 3, 4, 5 weeks to miscarriage much later in the process to a pretty horrific miscarriage in my 2nd trimester that resulted in surgery and was just awful. Now, clearly there was something wrong, right? I'm very healthy. I was not drinking. I was not smoking. I was following guidelines. I was doing everything that I was supposed to do. Something wasn't right. The promise of gaining these keys, gaining right access to life, is that somebody like me would potentially have answers and also options, different ways to create the family that I was trying to create. There are other places throughout the book where we both talk about, health. My mother had a very rare form of cancer, neuroendocrine cancer, and she was seen with specialists at Mayo. She was down at MD Anderson in Texas, and there's a lot that it's like we've come very far, but there's so much that we don't really understand about our own biology. And in her case, she was on a cocktail of chemotherapies. There wasn't one designed specifically for her. And in that case, we are not there yet, but there is a lot of research being done in things like creating a virus. And a virus is really just like viruses get a bad rap. A lot of them are very bad. But another way to think about virus is a USB stick, right? Or a thumb drive, that little thing that you plug into your computer to transfer files. A virus is just a container for code. And, it's plausible that 10 years from now, somebody with the same type of cancer that my mom had, we would create a virus for that, deliver different instructions, and reduce the tumor or the cancerous cells from growing, or, cause them not to exist. There's work being done on longevity and on repairing cells in a way that allow us to age without getting older, or I guess get old without aging, if that makes sense, right? These are just very different approaches. And again, this is the kind of thing that challenges our mental models. But the options on the other side of this are profound. So there's a lot in the book about what all of this potentially means for the future of how we live, how long we live, and how we mitigate and manage the biological issues that challenge us.
I have to go into one of your scenarios. So the book is broken up into the risks, into history and risks and scenarios. And since we're talking about aging, the scenario that you have in there about aging, I think that really struck me because, to your point in this entire conversation, is that we need to start thinking through this now, because it sounds great. I'm not, I'm going to have all this collagen. I'm going to look fabulous. I'm going to live till 200. But the implications of that, are so profound for the economy, for politics, for everything. And I don't know, without giving too much away, could you just, tell us how you created these scenarios? And that was one that totally struck me as something that would resonate with our audience.
So let me just preface this by saying there are different types of scenarios. The scenarios that I would normally prepare with my team for a client are strategic. So these are seeking to answer questions about plausible alternative futures. There are normative scenarios, there are exploratory scenarios, but the point is those are intended to be sort of pragmatic, exploratory but pragmatic, rooted in data. There's another type of scenario, and that's a scenario that's more speculative. And what this seeks to do is to sort of force you into a state of reperception. And reperception is sort of seeing the white spaces around you, seeing what currently exists in a new light. And this is effective because, again, we tend to be pretty biased, and we tend to continue on a linear path oftentimes. This active reperception helps you imagine alternative futures, and then you can choose what to do. So the scenarios in the book are all very researched. They're all backed by data, but they are speculative. They are meant to sound like science fiction, although they are very much not fiction. I mean, they're fiction, but they're not like science fiction. So there's 5 of them, and each of them explores sort of a different cluster of topics. There's one, I spend half of my week in New York, and I'm a longtime reader of New York Magazine, and Adam Platt, for those of you who are readers or foodies, you probably know his Where to Eat guide. So I was trying to imagine, like, what happens in this world where we can engineer tissue, meat, right? or wine or beer? What might a future where to eat guide look like? So we fast forwarded several years and wrote a guide. So the guide has things like the best new biofoundries, who's got the best bioreactors, and it's written just as you would read a restaurant review or where to eat guide in your local, newspaper, magazine, that sort of thing. The reason that it's effective is because it's familiar, but it forces us into a different state of mind, a different perspective. There's another one on aging and what happens when this technology gets applied to allow us, technically, to live longer lives. Would that be evenly distributed? What happens to sports in a world in which people can live ultra long lives? What does this mean about political appointments that are for life, lifetime terms? What does this mean for succession plans? And I'll admit that at the time I was writing that scenario, I was also watching the show Succession. So that was to some degree on my mind. But if you're part of a family dynasty and the elder members of that dynasty don't want to retire, but also aren't dying, what does that mean for maybe 5 generations of adults that are all now alive and want to be a part of the decision making? So those scenarios are intended to help you explore next order impacts. They read like fiction, and I think the people who skimmed the introduction to those set of chapters, that part of the book where we explain why we're doing this and the difference between a speculative scenario and a strategic scenario, got a little confused. We've seen a little bit of criticism here and there, people saying like, why are you writing science fiction? Anyways, but they're really effective tools to help you calibrate how you're thinking about the future.
I thought it was super effective. I mean, really made me think of how society needs to change, and the things that we need to do now, which again and again you say in the book, we have to think about it now on a state level, federal, both at a federal, but also at a local level. You give an example of how, we need to educate ourselves. So let's go to this misinformation, information, and how do we educate ourselves situation. So there's this situation where a rule came down and a county board, or was it a local board, had to make a decision on how to apply something, but they were not scientists, and they didn't have the tools to make the decision. And so maybe can we talk about how we arm ourselves with more information and better information about synthetic biology and about the future?
Right. This is really challenging. I was sort of sitting back watching people's reactions to COVID, or to coronavirus, I should say, when it was first happening, and it's a very natural response to be fearful. Especially again, like for people who were around at the beginning of the HIV/AIDS crisis, like there are some parallels that I was observing as we were learning about this new virus. I think that science continually becomes politicized, which is unfortunate. One of the data points we offer in the book was from a Pew study. It's fascinating. There was a survey done on like, who do you trust the most? And this was in the middle of COVID, I think, or at the beginning of it. Scientist was right up there with like my spiritual, religious, theological leader, teachers, and when that same group of people was asked whether or not they trust science, those numbers fell pretty sharply. So there's this delta between our trust in scientists and our trust in the work those people are doing, meaning the science. And that's a contradiction, I think, worth noting, because it helps us understand a little bit the situation that we're in right now. So the book launched in February. Just after it launched, I was doing a big media tour, and I sort of agreed to be on this show, Coast to Coast AM. Some of you may listen to that show. If you're not familiar with it, it is a show that airs coast to coast, and it is in the middle of the night. So I think I was on at 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. or something like that, my time. I got a variety of phone calls that night. And, I'm really grateful that I had that opportunity. and really glad that I did it, because I think we're not listening to people, especially when it comes to scary things like new viruses. When it comes to COVID, there was a lot of, yelling at people or chastising people. There wasn't a lot of listening. And I'm talking not like one-on-one. I think a lot of people were doing a great job listening to each other, but I'm sort of talking more at a global level, especially as it relates to, media. I don't think there was enough listening and empathizing. That night, towards the tail end, I was getting a little delirious because, it's the middle of the night, I'm tired. Somebody was concerned about, they thought they could get COVID from gardening from their soil, right? And she was genuinely concerned, and I felt it. So rather than shooting her down or telling her something different, I said, here's how I understand things, and why she didn't want to get the vaccine. And I said, do you play video games? She played video games. I said, cool. I love this game called Zelda. I love most of the iterations of Zelda. And my family also likes to play Zelda. And I'm now super busy at work, so I don't get to play. I'm not a time millionaire anymore. I don't have like endless hours to play Zelda. And my family members log on to my account and play as me, which I find incredibly annoying. So when I go back to sit down, I'm in some new realm. I have tools, but I have no idea what they are or how to use them. And I'm confronted with things on my path that may be benevolent or they may be monsters. I don't know. And at one point, there's there's this blob in front of me. It's a gelatinous looking transparent blob. The music, not quite sure. Maybe it's bad. Maybe it's okay. So the problem is, I don't know what to do with the blob. I don't know if I should cook the blob and eat it. I don't know if I should kill the blob. I don't know what that blob is because I don't recognize it. Later, when I see my family and they give me the instructions, oh, by the way, that blob is totally dangerous. It looks benign, but it will absolutely kill you. You have to use this tool in your tool belt. You have to go 1, 2, 3, and that's how you kill it. Once I have the instructions, I'm good to go. I have all this stuff. I just don't know what to do with it. That's what the vaccine does. The vaccine tells you that the vaccine is just the same instructions that my totally uncool family members who went ahead in the game gave to me. The stuff was already inside me. I already had the tool in my quiver. What I lacked was the information. So the virus or the vaccine, it's just the information that you need to recognize the blob and kill it the right way. That's all it does. I'm just relaying this because after I explained it to her, it was like, I could hear it in her voice. She felt relieved. I think she might have actually gone and gotten a vaccine after that. It totally changed her perspective. I never used a science word. I never used right. And it wasn't because I didn't think she would understand it. I'm sure she would have understood it, but it wasn't the right thing to say in that moment. And this is my concern with this field, the synthetic biology field, is that, well, first of all, nobody knows what these words mean. Synthetic biology, that's like industry branding, and I don't think it's great. So that already doesn't make sense. Also, it reminds me of Frankenstein. It is or like Dr. Moreau or Jurassic Park. The whole thing sounds bad to me, right? So we're going into this with some problems. We're on the heels of a horrific misinformation catastrophe as it relates to COVID and vaccines. And again, now is the time to do planning so that we have a strategy to manage the flow of information and how we're going to have these conversations. Because, very few people, I keep talking about Dolly the sheep, and a lot of people don't remember Dolly the sheep, but
I remember Dolly the sheep.
President Clinton had to have a press conference. The Pope had to have a press conference to calm people down. Collectively, we lost our shit as a planet when that announcement was made in the 90s. All these years later, we don't have demon spawn running around outside trying to kill us, we've got new therapeutics and medicines and materials and a whole bunch of other stuff that never actually happened. So we need to learn our lessons from Dolly. We need to learn our lessons from the early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We need to learn our lessons from how we managed the flow of information with COVID, because the stuff that's on the horizon is going to challenge people's thinking in ways that, significant and profound. But we can't wait. Because again, that's the reason that we wrote the book. Now is the time to think. And we want to have public debates. We want people to have a dialogue. We want people to challenge what we've written, as long as you've got data, it's fine. But now is the time to do that, not when the next big breakthrough happens or the next big announcement happens and everybody's under duress because of fear.
Yeah. I want to just mention to our audience, you can send in questions after our talk to Amy directly on Twitter or to us on Twitter. As long as Elon Musk doesn't shut Twitter down, we'll be on Twitter listening to you. So if we don't get to any of your questions, please do engage with us that way. And we do have a few more minutes. Nick, do you have a question?
Well, I think there's been a great conversation in the chat, and I really, how the extent to which the COVID crisis in the United States demonstrated a lot of these vulnerabilities, the lack of foresight, misinformation, um, the way in which believe the science, but really it also became, as long as I agree with the science, and science, of course, is always about testing hypotheses and coming up with new data, and yet people were very clinging to a science, say, of March of 2021 or of September of 2021, when it reflected their policy things. Now, some questions that have come in. I mean, Elsie Mayo asks about, are there multinational or national standards for foresight that you find encouraging that we can build on? And Boyan Francouz talks about Canada's Policy Horizons Office. Is that a way forward? Michelle Mattei has talked about what the EU has been doing. Do you see elements there? And in particular, we've had some political figures. I'm thinking particularly of Nils Schmid in Germany, talking about the United States, Europe, East Asia, India coming together to kind of form a technology coalition moving forward. Do you see some positive sides where this could go forward? And I just also want to throw in the other question, though, when we talk about these international coalitions, because several people have raised this, are we really talking about the wealthier countries, and where do the poor countries fit in the grand scheme of things?
Right. So there were 4 points in that. So let me answer the last point first, because that's the easiest. Yeah, obviously, we are only ever talking about wealthy countries. The emerging markets, the developing economies, they're always last. So yes, it would be wonderful and useful if in work that is related to foresight or to future of technology, future of synbio, biotech, whatever it is, that we bring these other stakeholders to the table and recognize that they are, part of the planet too. I think that would be wonderful. Now, on the second issue having to do with global coalitions, there are lots of examples. I think, especially when it comes to AI, I proposed what I called Gaia, the Global Alliance on Intelligence Augmentation, and in my last book, which is The Big Nine, with a very robust description of what that would look like and how it should function. And there have been variations since that book was published. There have been variations of that proposed, and I think in the EU there's some form of that, because I did a little bit of advising for a few minutes. So I think some version of that is moving forward. I think also the United States has launched some type of, what year is this? I think the US had launched some version of this. I don't know where it is yet. I haven't followed the development on that. But the bottom line is, there, everybody's got a framework a set of recommendations, an ethical guideline on AI now. I mean, everybody. And the problem is that none of these things are really enforceable. So it's about getting the right power brokers together. I mean, it's like everything. You got to get the right people at the right room at the right time, incent them to act and create some type of framework that is unattractive, creates unattractive circumstances if they deviate. So that's that. But it's really hard to get alignment on these things, especially when you've got a global hegemon like China that is pushing in its own direction, and through the Belt and Road Initiative, collecting signatories and others along the way. Somewhere in the middle of that, there was a question about national foresight offices. So yes, Canada has Horizons Canada. There's the Nordics. There's a lot of foresight activity, especially in Finland. Foresight is part of governmental activities in Asia. So there's actually a lot. There's also a federal foresight community in the United States that various people belong to. From my vantage point, what's lacking in the US is not an enthusiastic base for foresight within the federal government, but some type of coordinating office that is cabinet level, perhaps, or something equivalent that has real staying power and some type of enforcement mechanism. We don't have, and has the political capital and attractiveness that, regardless of which party is in office at that moment, like the cool kids are in that office, and there's a net benefit to helping that work continue. Like that, from my point of view, that's the missed opportunity. That's what's missing.
I think that there is so much more that we could talk about. This is a really excellent book. Thank you so much for joining us. The Genesis Machine, Our Quest to Rewrite Life in the Age of Synthetic Biology. Some great recommendations and a start of a discussion that I think we'll be talking about for years to come. Let's open the discussion now, today. Get the book, read it. It's wonderful. It's such a great fun read.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today, and hope to have you back when these offices exist.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on the show, and everybody for being here with us.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And as Tatiana said, please continue the conversation at Doorstep Podcast on Twitter. And no reason for it to stop this evening, although we will have to bring this part of the program to a close. So with that, thank you all for attending and wishing everyone a good evening.